With me is Jim O'Neill, who wears several hats. He, of course, currently is a senior advisor at Chatham House, has been in the past the Commerce Secretary of UK, also Chief Economist at Goldman Sachs. But he has been someone who has been remembered for coining the acronym BRIC, which is known as BRICS today. Sir, welcome to WION from London. And my first question to you is, how do you see the trajectory of this grouping, the BRICS grouping?
So I think you have to think about it differently in terms of the economics and the geopolitics. Obviously, when I created the acronym, which is now just over 22 years ago, actually, it was completely based on economic ideas, although I did suggest, because of it, each of the four big BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India and China, should become part of what I then described as an expanded G7, at the same time as the Euro members, Germany, France and Italy, consolidating to just one. So it would effectively be something like a G8 or a G9. But the main thing that I was focused on was the rising share of global GDP that each of the four BRICS countries would likely achieve in coming decades. And of course, China in particular, but to a similar way, although not on the same scale, China and India have become much bigger, although Brazil and Russia have been, especially since the start of the second decade of the acronym, very disappointing. So much so that their weight in global GDP is actually back to where it was in 2001. And South Africa, whilst it's a very interesting country, and geopolitically, of course, very interesting with Africa, economically, it's not a particularly important country. It's not even the biggest country in the continent of Africa.
Mm-hmm. And how do you see one of the key outcomes of the Johannesburg BRICS summit, that is the expansion of the grouping? Today, BRICS is BRICS 11. Do you think expansion is a good thing for BRICS, or do you think that this will be something that will be a cause of concern in the future?
I am disappointed by it for a number of reasons, but there are three basic ones. First of all, since they became a political grouping in 2009-10, the BRICS leaders have not really achieved anything. Partly because of their own differences, which perhaps we'll discuss more, is particularly true, of course, between India and China. But they don't seem to have got beyond this very powerful symbolism as being a group that doesn't involve the US and is constantly bemoaning their lack of representation in global governance. The second reason is there was no objective guidance as to why, for example, in Africa, Ethiopia and Egypt became members, and a country which is much more important strategically, economically, demographically, Nigeria, was not. And why in Latin America, not Mexico, but Argentina? And it seems like a very ramshackle group of countries that were chosen rather than any real strategic, obvious reason. And then the third reason is the simple one, is that if you expand any group of countries trying to supposedly agree policies, as we see with the G20, the more you add, the harder it becomes. And so I'm not quite sure, other than this really big symbolism, quite what the expanded BRICS is supposed to be trying to achieve.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned about it. How do you think that India-China worsening relationship will impact the dynamics within the BRICS grouping?
I think it itself undermines anything the BRICS countries may try and achieve. And in fact, as I wrote something last week, about the G20 meeting that was successfully hosted by Modi, I think it was a major diplomatic mistake of President Xi to not personally attend the G20. It was only 2 weeks after the BRICS meeting, and he appeared to, as did the Chinese media, make a huge amount of propaganda about how important it was. Then he didn't even have the courtesy of turning up to a G20 meeting hosted by a fellow BRICS country. And it obviously suggests that the relationship between China and India is not good. And so how can the BRICS group achieve anything when it's easily its two most important members don't really seem to agree on virtually anything of mutual importance, other than this symbolism that they both independently like to claim they're the leader of the global South.
You mentioned about G20. Now, what's your assessment about the Delhi G20 summit? How big it is a diplomatic victory for India in the international geopolitical scenario or sphere?
Well, it was, but of course, the dispute with Canada is threatening to overshadow what appeared to be quite a very successful diplomatic success for Modi. In the background to the G20, and because of Russia, but also because of the growing and worrying disputes between the US and China, many people, myself included, were worrying that the G20 would struggle to function. And in fact, there was some fears there would not even be a communique at this G20. But not only was there a very long communique, but also, of course, there was the very, very interesting decision to add the African Union to make it effectively a G21. And I think there was obviously some very clever diplomacy going on between senior G20 Sherpas in Washington and New Delhi, which made all of that possible. And in my opinion, I really welcome that, because I do believe the G20 is the right forum to deal with truly, truly global issues of today, because especially now with the African Union in there, you have over 85% of global GDP and a vast amount of the world's population represented, whereas in the expanded BRICS or the G7, you don't have either.
For the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, how big it is a diplomatic victory personally, if you can talk about that?
Well, I think it was a huge diplomatic victory, and it tended to suggest that Modi treats the G20 more seriously than he treats the BRICS group. But it also suggests that India has this very, very clever ability to navigate good relationships with the West, as well as good relationships with the so-called emerging world, and managing to navigate the very difficult global geopolitical situation between the US and China. And as I say, if it would not have been for the dispute with Canada, which does threaten to overshadow all of this, I add again, it was a great success for Modi.
And do you see India emerging as the voice of the global South? Now, I'm asking this question because China also claims to represent the voice of the global South. So where do you see India standing when it comes to representing the global South at various global forums?
I mean, I think it's impossible for China to disappear as a voice on anything. China, over the past 25 years, has been the single biggest contributor to global GDP growth, more than the United States. And there is not any particular market in the world, whether it be commodities or tourism or anything, that the Chinese don't have a major impact on. And that's true about global diplomacy and of course China's own voice as seeing itself the leader of the global South. And so I think we will continue with this slightly strange, almost competitive situation where each of China and India regard themselves as the leader of the global South, which frankly will become more and more interesting as each of these countries become bigger. And of course, because of each of their dynamics, it is probably the case that over the next decade, India will grow by more than China. And India, by the end of this decade, will probably become at least as big, if not bigger than Germany, and getting close to being the third largest economy ahead of Japan, which means India's stance in many of these issues, including being this voice of the global South, will become more and more credible. But China's not going away anywhere soon.
So you mentioned about India's growing clout, India becoming one of the largest economies in the world, the third largest. So how do you see India's diplomatic weight also growing?
I mean, I think if you look through long history, and I'm not a particular expert on history, but casual observation suggests that countries that get bigger become more and more important in global affairs, including diplomacy. So we already see it. And in fact, probably the whole reason why the United States was very eager to support Modi in having a successful G20 is recognition of India's growing importance already. India, in the past 2 years, has become bigger than France and the UK to be the fifth largest economy in the world. And as it gets to be the third largest, it is going to become more important in all of these issues around the world.
And amidst the rise of India, do you think that the ongoing dispute with Canada, the Canadian Prime Minister coming up with those allegations, do you think this is going to impact Canada, or where do you see the trajectory of India-Canada relationship?
I am very reluctant to comment on that because it's not something I am particularly an expert on or have no inside knowledge or expertise. But obviously, it looks like the Canadians feel very, very upset by it. And I was just reading something this morning about how they've shared their intelligence with Western allies. So we will have to see how this dispute develops. And it might well be a bit of a challenge as to how Mr. Modi presents his own position on this issue, because obviously, along with becoming a bigger voice, also means you have to take greater accountability and responsibility for your position on what many, many countries regard as the right principles as you go forward. So it's something that Mr. Modi and his advisors are going to have to think about very carefully.
So you are, of course, well known for coining the acronym BRIC. But in today's context, which is the grouping you will place your bet on? Is it the G20? Is it the BRICS? Is it the SCO as well, which is seen as a non-Western grouping? At a time, of course, when we know that the United Nations is being seen very dysfunctional.
Easy for me, the G20. Even though all of these different bodies have great difficulties being fruitful in this complex modern world, I think the G7 nor the BRICS are in the slightest bit capable of being globally influential. And I think the G20, because effectively it is amalgamation of the BRICS as it was before it expanded and the G7, is a very, very sensible grouping, which is of sufficiently small numbers compared to the UN, where it can really deal with big global issues, whether they be economic growth, economic fairness, global climate change, infectious disease prevention, and so on. And I think we saw some of that in the New Delhi statement. And it's very much a relief after a few years where the G20 became almost dysfunctional, that it seems to be back on some kind of track. And in fact, if the G20 can carry on that position, then it might in itself be able to help the UN become a bit more functional than it seems to be. But the UN is a very, very complex organization in trying to get things done that it represents.
And any last word on any new acronym you might be right now just thinking about? I mean, you have not only come up with acronym of BRIC, but other as well. So any other acronym you are planning on?
I mean, I'd just like to say that actually there was only ever two acronyms that I truly created. One was the BRICS, and the other was the N11 or the Next 11. Well, what you read about other acronyms I supposedly created were effectively created on the back of just articles I wrote, and somebody somewhere in the global media created that acronym and claimed it was me. So that was a phase of 3 or 4 years of slight acronym madness. And I joked to a couple of people I know well in the international diplomatic circles that after this BRICS expansion, perhaps the reason, if there was a logic as to why they chose the countries, is it was impossible to create an acronym in English out of them. But I won't be rushing to create any more, because I think the BRICS one lives on. And if they are going to expand in the future, it probably will come from members of the next 11 largest emerging nations like Indonesia, maybe Mexico, maybe Turkey, who knows.
But it was quite a catchy acronym, the BRIC of the geopolitics. Thank you so much, sir, for speaking to WION from London.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you, sir.